All right, so this is Chapter 6, Lesson 2. And Chapter 6, Lesson 2 is going to talk about biological evolution. Biological evolution is the change over time of populations of related organisms. So we're looking at how things change over time. And one of the people who came up with an idea about this was this guy over here on the side, whose name is Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin was a naturalist who developed a theory about how evolution works. And the way he did this was, it took many years for him to really come up with this theory and really decide that to publish his information and to really talk about it. But most of his ideas were based back when he was younger, and he was a naturalist on a ship called the HMS Beagle. And the HMS Beagle was going around exploring the New World, and Darwin was a naturalist on this ship. His job was to collect samples and make observations on the voyage. So he was really taking detailed notes and drawings and collecting bits and pieces of all of the things he saw on these travels that he was on. And one of the places that he visited while he was with the HMS Beagle was the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands are a set of islands just off the coast of Ecuador. And what he noticed while he was on these islands was that the plants and the animals on each island were very similar to each other, and they were also very similar to those of Ecuador. However, they were not identical. So there were little differences between these plants and animals on each island and on Ecuador, but they were still very similar to each other. So during this time, he studied some tortoises and mockingbirds and finches, and he noticed that there was a relationship between each species and the food sources of the area in which it lived. So one of the big differences was with the finches. He noticed that the finches had different shaped beaks based on what food was available for them to eat on the specific island it was on or on Ecuador. So because of all of these things he saw and these observations he made, he came up with this hypothesis. And his hypothesis was that all of these things were related. So all of the finches were related and they had a common ancestor, but they changed because of the food source that was available to them. And so through all of these ideas and these observations and studies, he came up with this idea called the theory of evolution by natural selection. So what this says is that members of a species have slight differences that we call variations. So little things that are different. And those with variations that benefit them are more likely to survive and pass on that variation to their offspring. So if you have things that make you more likely to survive, then you pass those on to your offspring. Because if you're dead, you can't reproduce, right? We already talked about that a little bit. So this was his theory. Those that had variations that were benefits to them were more likely to survive and pass on the variation to their offspring. So really what we say natural selection is a process where organisms with variations that help them survive in their environments live longer, compete better, and reproduce more than those without the variations. So we also say that this is survival of the fittest. So it's the thing that is most adapted to the environment, has the best traits for that environment. Those are the things that are going to live longer. Those are the things that are going to compete better. And because they live longer and compete better, those are the ones that reproduce more to pass those new traits on in the environment. So this idea of natural selection is what explains how populations change as their environments change. So remember we looked at, when we were talking about fossils back in lesson 1, we talked about how we use the fossil record to show how populations change as through time, right? Well, this natural selection idea is saying that here is why they change over time. Now, an adaptation is an inherited trait that increases an organism's chance of surviving and reproducing. So adaptations are things that make you more fit for your environment or better, more likely to survive in your environment. And there are 3 types of adaptations. The first one is a structural adaptation. So structural adaptations are physical characteristics. So these are things like color or shape or something like that. The second one is behavioral. So this is how the organism acts or behaves. So an example of behavioral adaptations would be things like hunting at night or moving in herds. And then the third one is a functional adaptation. Functional adaptations are the ones that involve the internal body systems that affect biochemistry. So examples of functional adaptations would be things like drop-in temperature during hibernation. Now, sometimes humans interfere, and we try to get the best trait that we can in the most desirable trait for us. And we do that through a process called selective breeding. Selective breeding is breeding of organisms for desired characteristics. So, for example, it's breeding chickens to have larger breasts because that's the part that we usually eat on the chicken, or to produce cows that produce more milk, or maybe it's even as simple as breeding the the most pure bred dog or something like that. So you're trying to get the desired characteristic. So humans will control that through this process of selective breeding. One example of selective breeding that's huge is like racehorses. They selectively breed racehorses to try to make sure that they've got the fastest horse. And that's the end of lesson 1. Lesson 2. So, thanks for listening.